What if everything you knew about history was a lie? What if the face that stared out from the official portraits, the hand that signed the royal decrees, the voice that addressed the parliament, all belonged not to a king, but to a masterful impostor? For 2 decades, a throne that was the very symbol of lineage and divine right was occupied by a cunning fraud, his true identity a secret so devastating it threatened to unravel the very fabric of a nation. This is not a fantasy. It is a hidden truth, buried beneath layers of official records and silenced whispers. The story you're about to hear is one of audacious deception, a secret so profound it redefines our understanding of power and legacy. To uncover more of history's greatest enigmas, remember to subscribe to our channel, History 1. Now, let us pull back the velvet curtain and reveal the truth. The year was 1743, and the kingdom of Eldoria was on the brink. The ailing King Alaric of the House of von Habsburg lay shrouded in silks and the cloying scent of medicinal herbs, his once robust frame now a gaunt echo against the goose-down pillows. The royal physicians moved with a hushed funereal gravity, their whispered consultations doing little to mask the grim prognosis. Consumption, the White Plague, was claiming its most regal victim. In the antechambers of the Schönbrunn Palace, a different sickness festered, the sickness of ambition and fear. The king's only heir, his son Prince Leopold, was a boy of just 16, his character still unformed, a delicate youth known more for his love of poetry and astronomy than for the grim realities of statecraft. Chancellor Otto von Gortz, a man whose jowls seemed to carry the weight of the entire empire, paced the marble floor. "The boy is not ready," he muttered, to the only other man in the room, the king's most trusted personal secretary, a slender, unassuming figure named Klaus Richter. "The moment Alaric breathes his last, the wolves will descend. Prussia to the north, France to the west. They will tear Eldoria apart, piece by gilded piece." Klaus, a man who had built a career on being unnoticed, merely nodded, his eyes, sharp and intelligent, fixed on the dancing flames in the hearth. He was a man of files and ciphers, a keeper of secrets, and he knew the Chancellor was right. The prince was a sapling in a gathering storm. It was on the 3rd night of the death watch that the impossible happened. A violent coughing fit seized the king, a racking spasm that seemed to shake the very foundations of the great bed. As it subsided, he gestured weakly for his son. The young Leopold, his face pale with fear and exhaustion, approached. The king's hand, trembling and skeletal, grasped his. With a final, rattling exhalation, King Alaric IV passed from the world. A wail went up from the Queen, a sound of pure, unadulterated grief. But in the chaos of that moment, as courtiers fell to their knees and prayers were hastily begun, a second, quieter tragedy occurred. The young prince, overwhelmed by the loss, the stifling air, and the sheer weight of his new destiny, stumbled back from the deathbed. His foot caught on the edge of an ornate Persian rug, and he fell, striking his temple with a sickening crack against the sharp corner of a gilded table. He did not cry out. He simply lay still, a trickle of dark blood stark against his alabaster skin. For a moment there was silence, broken only by the Queen's sobs. Then chaos erupted anew. The physicians rushed to the prince. Chancellor von Gortz stared, his face a mask of horror. The monarchy, the entire von Habsburg line, had been extinguished in a single, cruel minute. It was then that Klaus Richter moved. While all eyes were on the 2 still forms, the dead king and the mortally wounded prince, he did not look at them. His gaze swept the room, calculating, cold, devoid of the panic that gripped everyone else. He saw the void, the absolute collapse of order that would come with the dawn. He saw the end of Eldoria as they knew it. And in that void, an idea was born. A monstrous, brilliant, and utterly unthinkable idea. He approached the Chancellor, taking his arm and steering him forcefully into a secluded alcove. "Otto," he whispered, his voice low and urgent, cutting through the Chancellor's stunned stupor. "Look at them. Look at the prince." Von Gortz, his mind reeling, looked. The boy was being lifted, his head lolling, the blood a vivid stain on his blonde hair. "He is gone," Klaus stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "The king is dead. The heir is dead. What happens when this news reaches the streets of Vienna by morning? What happens when the couriers carry this news to Berlin and Paris?" The Chancellor's portly frame seemed to deflate. It is the end. God have mercy on us, it is the end. No, Klaus said, his grip tightening on the Chancellor's arm. It is not the end. It is a beginning. But we must act now. We must commit a sin so great it will save the nation. Von Gort stared at him, uncomprehending. What are you talking about, Richter? What sin? Klaus leaned in closer, his words barely a breath. The prince is unconscious, gravely injured. We will say he is in a stable but delicate condition, unable to be seen. We will announce the king's death, but we will proclaim that his final act was to pass the crown to his son Leopold, who will rule with a regency council until he is fully recovered. That is madness, the Chancellor hissed. He is dying, or he will be disfigured, mentally addled, just we cannot— We will not be using him, Klaus interrupted, his eyes gleaming in the dim light. I know a man, a player from a travelling theatre troupe currently performing in a beer hall in the old town. His name is Caspar. He is a talent, a mimic of unparalleled skill, and Chancellor, he is the prince's mirror image. Vonor. Gortz recoiled as if struck. He opened his mouth to protest, to call for the guards, to have this secretary thrown into the deepest dungeon for such treasonous blasphemy. But the words died in his throat. He looked back at the chaos in the bedchamber, at the two bodies that represented the collapse of his life's work, his power, his very world. He saw the abyss. And then he looked at Klaus Richter's calm, determined face. The unthinkable was beginning to seem like the only option. The silence in the alcove was thicker than the mourning drapes that would soon adorn the palace. Chancellor von Gortz felt the weight of history, of damnation, pressing down on him. He could hear the ragged breaths of the Queen, the frantic whispers of the physicians still working over the prince's inert form. To even consider Richter's proposal was treason of the highest order, a sin that would condemn his soul for eternity. Yet, the alternative, the sack of Vienna, the end of the von Habsburg dynasty, his own head on a pike, was a far more immediate and tangible hell. A player, he finally whispered, his voice hoarse with disbelief and a terrifying, burgeoning hope. You would place a common mummer on the sun throne of Eldoria? I would place a face on the throne, Klaus corrected, his tone pragmatic, devoid of the Chancellor's moral turmoil. A face that the people, the court, and our enemies will recognize and obey. The mind behind that face will be ours, a regency council, you, myself, perhaps one or two others we can absolutely trust. We will rule, Chancellor. We will guide Eldoria through this peril. We will save it. And the real prince? What if he recovers? Klaus's gaze was icy. The physicians are not optimistic. The head injury is severe. We will ensure he's moved to a secluded wing of the palace, cared for in absolute secrecy. His survival is a complication we will manage should it arise. For now, he is a non-factor. The world must believe that Prince Leopold survived the shock of his father's death and is now, by divine right and his father's final wish, King Leopold V. Von Gortz ran a trembling hand over his face. The plan was insane. It was a house of cards that a single errant breeze could topple. But the alternative was a bonfire. He gave a slow, grim nod. God forgive us. God helps those who help themselves, Klaus replied, a faint cold smile touching his lips. Now, we must move. You will handle the announcement. The king is dead. The prince is in a deep, healing sleep, and by royal decree a regency is formed. I will handle the rest. While the Chancellor, his face a mask of sombre authority, began to deliver the carefully crafted lie to the assembled, grieving courtiers, Klaus Richter slipped away. He did not call for a guardsman or a servant. This was a task for him alone. Donning a heavy, nondescript cloak, he left the palace through a little-used postern gate, melting, into the foggy, pre-dawn streets of Vienna. The contrast was jarring. One moment he was amidst the opulent, death-filled silence of the palace. The next he was in the raucous, stinking vitality of the old town. He found the beer hall, the Golden Grape, its sign creaking in the damp air. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the smell of spilled ale, and the roar of a drunken crowd. On a makeshift stage, a performance was underway, and there he was, Caspar. Klaus stood in the shadows, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was one thing to know of the man's resemblance, it was another to see it. The player was younger than the prince by a few years, perhaps 19, and there was a coarseness to him that the royal upbringing had polished away. His hair was the same shade of wheat gold, his eyes the same piercing blue. His build was similar, though leaner, harder, born of a life far removed from palace comforts. But the bone structure, the high cheekbones, the line of the jaw, was uncanny. He was currently playing a foppish nobleman, and his imitation of the aristocratic mannerisms was so perfect, so nuanced, that it sent a chill down Klaus's spine. This was not mere mimicry, it was absorption. He watched as Caspar held the audience in the palm of his hand, his voice projecting effortlessly, a flawless, educated cadence that belied his surroundings. He had talent, more than talent, he had genius, the very genius they needed. After the performance, Klaus intercepted him as he came off the stage, wiping grease paint from his face with a dirty rag. "A remarkable performance," Klaus said quietly. Caspar looked him up and down, instantly assessing the quality of his cloak, the fine leather of his boots. "Thank you, my lord. Flattery will get you everywhere, but a silver coin will get you further." "I have something far more valuable than silver," Klaus said. "A role, the role of a lifetime." Caspar laughed, a sharp, cynical sound. "Let me guess. A wealthy merchant, a dashing count. I've played them all." Klaus leaned closer. "A king." The player's smile vanished. He studied Klaus's face, looking for the joke. Finding none, he gestured to a quieter corner near the barrels of ale. "Explain. Quickly." And Klaus did. He laid out the bare bones of the situation, watching the young man's face cycle through disbelief, terror, and finally a dark, glittering avarice. "You are mad," Caspar breathed, but his eyes were alight with the sheer, terrifying scale of the proposition. They would hang, draw, and quarter me. They would burn the pieces. "They would, if you were discovered," Klaus agreed calmly, "but you will not be. You have the face. You have the voice. I will provide the rest, the knowledge, the mannerisms, the history. In return, you will live a life of unimaginable luxury. You will have power beyond your wildest dreams. For 20 years, you will be the most powerful man." "In Eldoria!" Caspar was silent for a long time, his actor's mind no doubt racing through the scenes, the possibilities, the ultimate performance. He looked at his calloused hands, at the grimy floor of the beer hall, then back at Klaus. "And after 20 years?" he asked. "After 20 years," Klaus said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "we stage the final act, the king's tragic premature death, and you, Caspar, disappear, a wealthy man, your name forgotten, your legend secure." A slow, dangerous smile spread across the player's face, a smile the real Prince Leopold with his gentle soul would never have been capable of. "The role of a lifetime," he repeated, the words now filled with a new, ominous meaning. "Very well, Secretary Richter, I accept. When do I meet my public?" Dawn was breaking over Vienna, painting the city's spires in hues of rose and gold, as Klaus Richter returned to the palace. He was not alone. Beside him, swathed in the deep hood of Klaus's own cloak, walked Caspar. The journey through the secret passages and service corridors of Schönbrunn was conducted in absolute silence. The few servants they passed were loyal to Klaus, men and women whose debts or secrets he owned, and they averted their eyes without a word. The air in the palace was heavy with a stifled grief, the quiet chaos of a world trying to right itself after a seismic shift. Klaus took the player not to the royal apartments, but to his own private suite of offices, a labyrinth of rooms filled with books, state documents, and maps. Only then did he allow Caspar to lower his hood. The young man looked around, his actor's eyes missing nothing, the richness of the velvet drapes, the sheen of the polished mahogany, the sheer intimidating weight of knowledge contained in the shelves that stretched to the ceiling. He was no longer the brash performer from the beer hall, a nervous awe had tempered his demeanour. "This is where you will be prepared," Klaus stated, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet room. "You have the face and the voice, Caspar, but that is merely the canvas. Now we must paint the masterpiece. We have days, perhaps only hours, before you must make your first appearance." He moved to a large, locked chest, producing a heavy, leather-bound folio. Inside were not state secrets, but something far more personal, a collection of the late Prince Leopold's journals, his lesson books, sketches he had made, and sheaves of his poetry. "Your first lesson," Klaus said, placing a journal before Caspar. "His handwriting. You must replicate it perfectly. Not just the shape of the letters, but the pressure, the flow, the slight tremor on the upstroke. He then produced a series of small framed portraits. These are his tutors, his friends, the members of the court. You will memorize every name, every title, every known detail of their relationship with the prince. A single misstep, a moment of hesitation when Countess Wilhelmina greets you, and the entire illusion shatters. For the next 48 hours, Caspar was immersed in the life of the boy he was to become. He slept little. He ate at the desk. Under Klaus's relentless tutelage, he practiced the prince's signature until his hand cramped. He learned the specific way Leopold held his teacup, the slight stammer he affected when nervous, his love for the constellations of the northern hemisphere, his disdain for hunting, his secret fear of horses. Klaus was a brutal taskmaster. No, he would snap, striking the desk with his hand. The prince would never stand with his weight on one hip like a common soldier. He is fluid, almost delicate in his posture. Again, he drilled Caspar on the complex web of Eldorian politics. The von Gortz family are our allies, but do not trust the younger son, Friedrich. He is a gambler and a gossip. The archbishop is a pious man, but his ambition is for the church, not the crown. Agree with him, but promise nothing. It was during a lesson on the prince's childhood that Caspar looked up, his face pale with exhaustion. He sounds lonely. Klaus paused, momentarily thrown. It was an observation of genuine empathy, an emotion he had not factored into his calculations. He was the heir to a throne, he replied coldly. Loneliness is a privilege he could not afford, and it is a luxury you cannot afford either. Your sentimentality will get us all killed. Now, the Treaty of Westphalia. What were its 3 primary consequences for Eldoria? The final and most critical test came on the 3rd day. Chancellor von Gortz was ushered into the room. He had been avoiding this moment, the physical proof of their damnation. He stood stiffly as Caspar, who had been practicing at the window, turned to face him. The Chancellor's breath caught in his throat. The player was dressed in one of the prince's simpler outfits. He had been washed, his hair styled precisely as Leopold wore his. He held himself with a hesitant, almost fragile dignity that was a perfect imitation of the boy he had seen just days before. But it was the eyes that were the most unnerving. The real Leopold's eyes had been kind, dreamy. This young man's eyes held a sharp, watchful intelligence, a flicker of something hard and ambitious that he quickly masked with a convincing display of sorrowful resolve. "Chancellor," Caspar said, his voice a perfect, mournful echo of the prince's, I am ready to receive your counsel in this, my hour of grief. My father." He let the sentence hang, a masterful display of choked emotion. Von Gortz could only stare. The performance was flawless. It was a resurrection. It was a desecration. He felt a wave of nausea but forced it down. He bowed, his voice thick with a strange mixture of horror and relief. "Your Majesty," he murmured. The words felt like ash in his mouth. Klaus allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The first and most important audience had been convinced. "Good," Klaus said, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "The official coronation will be a simple, somber affair in a week's time, given the circumstances. But before that, you must be seen. The court is swirling with rumours. They need to see their king, to be reassured." He walked to the window, pointing down into the main courtyard. "In 1 hour, a delegation from the northern provinces will be passing through on their way to the stables. You will walk on the balcony. You will not wave. You will not smile. You will simply stand, looking out over your city with a countenance of solemn, regal grief. You will be seen. That is all. Can you do that?" Caspar, now Leopold, turned to look at the courtyard. A slow, calculated smile, one that never reached his cold blue eyes, touched his lips. It was an expression the real prince would never have made. "It will be my finest performance," the Impostor King said softly. The stone of the balcony was cold beneath Caspar's thin slippers, a stark contrast to the warm, late-morning sun on his face. He kept his hands resting lightly on the balustrade, just as Klaus had instructed, resisting the urge to grip the stone for support. Below, the palace courtyard was a hub of controlled activity. Liveried servants hurried about their duties, a contingent of the royal guard changed shifts with a crisp metallic rhythm, and a group of dignitaries in sombre, dark cloaks were being escorted towards the stables. the northern delegation. Klaus Richter stood just inside the shadow of the French doors behind him, a silent, watchful spectre. Caspar could feel his gaze like a physical pressure. This was not the stage of a beer hall. There was no room for ad-libbing, for playing to the crowd. Here, the slightest error was not a missed cue, it was treason. He took a slow, quiet breath, filling his lungs as the prince would have, shallow, controlled. He let his shoulders slump just a fraction, not with the exhaustion of a common player, but with the profound, noble grief of a son who had just lost a father and a king. He fixed his eyes not on any one person, but on the distant spires of the city, allowing his gaze to become unfocused, as if lost in a world of sorrow and heavy responsibility. He did not move. He simply was. It happened as subtly as Klaus had predicted. One of the northern nobles, a burly man with a thick red beard, glanced up towards the royal apartments. He stopped dead in his tracks, his mouth falling slightly open. He nudged the man next to him, an older, greying statesman. One by one, the entire delegation turned their faces upward. A silence fell over them. They did not cheer. It would have been inappropriate. They did not bow. He was too far away for formal protocol. They simply stood and looked. They saw the silhouette of their young king bathed in sunlight, bearing his burden with a quiet, stoic dignity. It was a picture of perfect, tragic royalty. Caspar held the pose for a moment longer. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he turned his head just enough to look down upon the delegation. He did not meet their eyes directly, but let his gaze pass over them, a monarch acknowledging his subjects without the need for words. He saw the look on their faces, not just curiosity but a dawning respect, a reassurance. The line of von Habsburg endured. The throne was not empty. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and walked back through the French doors, disappearing into the gloom of the palace. The moment the doors closed behind him, the performance ended. The sorrowful resolve melted from his face, replaced by a sharp, exhilarated intensity. He looked at Klaus, his heart hammering against his ribs, not with fear, but with the thrill of it all. "Well?" he asked, his voice dropping back into its natural, slightly rougher cadence. Klaus allowed himself a rare, genuine nod of approval. It was a small, almost imperceptible gesture, but for him it was a roaring ovation. "Adequate," he said, the single word holding a universe of relief. They saw what they needed to see. The rumours of his incapacity will begin to die. Now, the real work begins. He led Caspar to a large table where a magnificent suit of black velvet and silver thread had been laid out. "Your coronation attire. It will be altered to your measurements. The ceremony itself will be short. The archbishop will anoint you, place the crown upon your head, and you will swear the oath. I have the text for you to memorize. The words are simple, but the delivery is everything. You must sound weary, yet resolute, young, yet wise beyond your years." As Caspar ran his fingers over the rich velvet, a thought, cold and practical, occurred to him. "The real prince," he said, his voice low. "Where is he? What is his condition?" Klaus's expression did not change. "That is no longer your concern. Your concern is to be him. The boy in the West Wing is a patient of the crown, a tragic soul who requires our care. Nothing more. But if he wakes up, if he talks—" "He will not talk," Klaus said, his tone final, leaving no room for argument. "The physicians are certain the damage is profound. He exists in a twilight. He is not a threat to you, Caspar. The only threat to you sits at this table, in this room. It is the threat of your own imperfection, the threat of a forgotten detail, a misplaced word, a moment of your former commonness, breaking through the royal facade. That is what you must fear, not a ghost in the West Wing." He picked up a heavy, leather-bound book, The Lineage of the House von Habsburg. "Now, your great-grandfather, Alaric II. He was known as the Iron Duke. You will need to be able to speak of his campaigns against the Ottomans with the familiarity of a boy who grew up with these stories at his grandfather's knee. Let us begin." Caspar looked from the book to the coronation robes, then back to Klaus. The reality of the deception was settling upon him, heavier than any crown. He was no longer just playing a part, he was entombing the real Leopold, a boy he had never met, and building his own kingdom upon the grave. He pushed the thought aside, a flicker of the hard survivor from the beer hall reasserting itself. He had his role. He would play it better than anyone had ever played any role before. The Cathedral of St. Sigismund was a cavern of incense and shadow, its towering Gothic arches seeming to strain towards heaven under the weight of the occasion. Every stained glass window depicting saints and martyrs was dimmed by the sombre mood within. The air thrummed with the whispered prayers of 1,000 souls, the rustle of silk and the soft clink of ceremonial armour. The entire court of Eldoria was packed into the pews, a sea of anxious, watchful faces. In the front row, Queen Mother Eleanor, her face a pale, beautiful mask of grief, clutched a lace handkerchief so tightly her knuckles were white. At the great oaken doors Caspar waited. He was clad in the black velvet and silver, the weight of the fabric unfamiliar and oppressive. The crown, a simple gold circlet for now, felt cold upon his brow. Chancellor von Gort stood on one side of him, a pillar of grim authority, and Klaus Richter in the robes of a senior court secretary stood on the other, a silent puppeteer. "Remember," Klaus murmured, his voice barely a breath. "Slow steps. Keep your head high, but your gaze downcast until you reach the altar. When you kneel, let it be a movement of humility, not weakness." Caspar did not respond. He was already slipping into the role, shedding the last vestiges of Caspar the player. He was Leopold now. He felt the prince's supposed grief, the overwhelming terror of the responsibility. He let it flood him, using it, channeling it. His hands trembled, and he did not try to stop them. It was fitting for a grieving son. The great organ boomed, a sound that vibrated through the stone floor. The doors swung open. 1,000 heads turned. A collective, hushed intake of breath filled the nave. And then he began to walk. Every step was measured, a slow, mournful cadence on the polished stone. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant figure of the archbishop, a golden, mitred statue before the high altar. He could feel the weight of their stares, the nobles, the foreign ambassadors, the generals. He saw pity in some eyes, calculation in others, and in a few a flicker of suspicion. He let his own expression remain a carefully composed blank, a young man numbed by loss, performing his duty because he must. He reached the altar and sank to his knees on the velvet cushion. The cold stone bit through the fine fabric of his breeches. The archbishop's voice, old and raspy, echoed through the cathedral, reciting the ancient Latin rites. Caspar understood little of it, but he had been drilled on the responses. "Spiritus Sanctus superveniat int," the archbishop intoned, his thumb making the sign of the cross with holy oil on Caspar's forehead. The chrism was slick and cold. This was the moment, the anointing, the divine rite. A shiver that was not entirely feigned ran down his spine. He, a bastard son of a drunken actress and an unknown father, was being anointed as God's chosen ruler. The blasphemy was so immense it was almost exhilarating. Then came the oath. He placed his hand on the heavy jewel-covered Bible. His voice, when he spoke, was clear and steady, carrying to the far corners of the cathedral, yet imbued with a convincing youthful tremor. "I, Leopold, 5th of that name, do solemnly swear to uphold the laws and traditions of the kingdom of Eldoria, to defend the faith, to protect my people, and to rule with justice and mercy, so help me God." The words were a lie wrapped in a sacred vow. He felt Klaus's gaze on the back of his neck, a silent command to perfection. Finally the archbishop lifted the great state crown of Eldoria, a monstrously heavy confection of gold, diamonds, and rubies. With a solemn grunt of effort he lowered it onto Caspar's head. The weight was instantaneous and shocking. It pressed down, a physical manifestation of the burden he had stolen. For a terrifying second his neck muscles buckled, and he feared he would stumble. But he locked his jaw, straightened his spine, and bore it. He was King Leopold III. He rose and turned to face his subjects. The organ swelled again, a triumphant, defiant note now. The assembled court as one rose to its feet and bowed. It was a wave of submission, a tide of acceptance. He had done it. The fraud was complete. His eyes swept the crowd, and for a fleeting moment they met those of the Queen Mother. Her gaze was not one of a mother looking upon her son. It was a look of profound, unsettling scrutiny. There was no love there, only a deep, searching confusion, as if she were trying to recognize a melody in a song that was played just slightly out of tune. Then she too lowered her head in a bow, the moment broken. The applause began, hesitant at first, then building into a thunderous, rolling wave that echoed off the ancient stones. Caspar stood, bearing the weight of the crown and the adulation, a perfect statue of a king. But inside, the player smiled. The reviews, it seemed, were excellent. The first year of the reign of King Leopold V was a masterclass in controlled illusion. Under the firm guidance of the Regency Council, dominated by Chancellor von Gortz and the increasingly powerful Klaus Richter, the kingdom stabilized. The threatened invasions from rival powers never materialized, held at bay by the show of a continuous legitimate monarchy. The public face of this stability was the young king, who appeared at carefully orchestrated events, opening a new bridge, attending a solemn mass for his father, receiving ambassadors with a quiet, dignified grace. In private, however, the reality was far more complex. Caspar's suite of rooms became his gilded cage and his rehearsal space. Klaus was a constant presence, a director who never called for a final curtain. "Your walk is improving," Klaus said one evening, observing Caspar pace the length of the royal study. "But you still swing your arms too much." The prince was contained. "Think of a dancer, not a soldier." Caspar stopped, a flash of irritation crossing his face before he smoothed it away. "I've spent the day reviewing tax proposals and listening to von Gortz drone on about grain tariffs. Forgive me if my posture isn't perfectly poetic." "The moment you ask for forgiveness is the moment you admit you're not the king," Klaus replied coolly. He pointed to a stack of documents. "The Archbishop has requested an audience to discuss the seminary schools. You will listen, you will appear thoughtful, and you will tell him you defer to his wisdom in matters of the spirit, but that the Treasury requires a full report on the expenditures. It is a non-answer that sounds like piety and prudence." This was the daily grind of the deception. It was not just about grand gestures and public appearances, it was about 1,000 tiny details. It was about knowing that the king preferred his venison lightly seasoned, that he disliked the colour mauve, that he had a small, almost invisible scar above his left eyebrow from a childhood fall, a detail Klaus had provided a fabricated story for, should anyone ask. The greatest threat, however, came not from foreign spies or suspicious courtiers, but from within the palace itself. Queen Mother Eleanor. She requested weekly private audiences with her son. These were the most grueling performances of all. Klaus could drill him on politics and protocol, but he could not provide the intimate shared history of a mother and her child. She would sit with him in her sun-drenched solar, surrounded by her late husband's favourite books and her own collection of miniature portraits. "Do you remember, Leopold?" she asked one afternoon, her voice soft, her eyes never leaving his face. "The summer at the Lake Palace? You were 10. You fell out of the old willow tree trying to rescue that stray kitten. You broke your arm." Caspar's heart hammered against his ribs. This was not in the journals. This was a landmine. He took a slow sip of tea, buying a second to think. He gave a small, wistful smile, the one he'd practiced that conveyed fond memory tinged with sadness. "I remember the kitten got down by itself, Mother. I believe my pride was more injured than my arm." It was a safe, generic response, focusing on the universal childhood emotion of embarrassment. Eleanor's smile was thin, not quite reaching her eyes. "You cried for an hour. Your father was so cross with you for being so reckless." She leaned forward slightly. "He said you would never be a knight if you couldn't even climb a tree properly. What did you say to him?" Another test. Caspar felt a bead of sweat trace a path down his spine beneath his fine linen shirt. He looked down at his hands, feigning a painful memory. "I believe I told him I had no wish to be a knight. I wished to be an astronomer, to map the stars instead of battlefields." This was true to the prince's character as Klaus had described it. The Queen Mother leaned back, her expression unreadable. "Yes," she said softly, "that is what you said." But the tone of her voice suggested she was not convinced, merely cataloguing another piece of a disturbing puzzle. After these audiences, Caspar would often retreat to the palace's extensive library, the one place he could find a semblance of solitude. It was here, among the silent, leather-bound sentinels of knowledge, that he felt the true weight of his isolation. He was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. The only person who knew his true identity was Klaus, and their relationship was that of a warden and his prisoner, a director and his star actor. One night, staring at his reflection in the dark glass of a window, the face of King Leopold V staring back, a profound and chilling realization settled upon him. Caspar, the boy from the beer hall, was fading. Every day he buried him deeper under layers of royal mannerism and stolen history. How long until the performance was no longer a performance? How long until the impostor was all that remained? He turned from the window. It didn't matter. The stage was set. The audience was his, and the show, he knew, must go on. There was no going back. The Regency Council, intended as a temporary measure, solidified into the permanent shadow government of Eldoria. By the time King Leopold reached his nominal majority at 18, the charade of his rule was so deeply embedded that the official dissolution of the council changed little. Chancellor von Gortz handled the day-to-day administration of the empire, while Klaus Richter, now bearing the title of Chief Privy Councillor, managed the king, his schedule, his public utterances, his very identity. It was during a state banquet in honour of the visiting French ambassador that Caspar discovered a new, dangerous facet of his power. The ambassador, the Duc de Valois, was a notoriously arrogant man, known for his sharp tongue and his belief in French cultural superiority. Throughout the meal he made a series of subtly condescending remarks about Eldorian art, Eldorian wine, and by implication the young Eldorian king, who seemed more a quiet boy than a monarch. Caspar, following his script, remained silent, offering only polite non-committal smiles. But inside, the pride of Caspar the player, a man who had fought for every scrap of respect his entire life, began to simmer. He was not some noble-born weakling. He was a survivor, and this preening peacock was insulting his kingdom, the one he was risking his neck to maintain. The Duke, perhaps emboldened by the king's passivity, turned to him directly. "Your Majesty must find the weight of the crown heavy indeed for one so young," he said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "It is a pity your esteemed father is not here to guide you. The art of statecraft is so nuanced." A silence fell over the high table. Chancellor von Gortz began to sputter a diplomatic response, but Caspar held up a single, quiet hand. It was a gesture Klaus had taught him, regal, commanding. He fixed his eyes on the Duke, and for the first time he let the careful, gentle mask of Leopold slip, just a fraction. He allowed a glimpse of the sharp, calculating intelligence that lay beneath. "Your concern is touching, Monsieur le Duc," Caspar said, his voice low but carrying perfectly in the hushed room. He did not smile. "But do not mistake contemplation for confusion. My father taught me that statecraft, like a fine wine, should not be gulped with boisterous haste, but sipped, its complexities appreciated." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the Frenchman's extravagant, almost foppish attire. "Of course, he also taught me that a man who feels the need to dress his opinions in such flamboyant silks often has little of substance to say. Tell me, how are the harvests in Burgundy this year? I understand the rains have been unkind." The insult was delivered with such perfect, icy precision that for a moment the Duke could only stare, his mouth slightly agape. He had expected a flustered boy and had been met with a razor's edge. The entire table watched, frozen. Then a low chuckle came from the head of the Eldorian military, old Field Marshal Bloch, a sound that broke the tension and was quickly followed by a wave of approving murmurs from the Eldorian nobles. The Duc de Valois, thoroughly bested, could only mutter something about the harvest being adequate and retreat into his wine-glass. Later, in the king's private chambers, Klaus was waiting for him. His expression was unreadable. "That was a risk," Klaus stated, his arms crossed. "He insulted the crown," Caspar replied, his blood still thrumming with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He was unbuttoning the heavy, jewelled doublet himself, a habit from his old life that Klaus disapproved of. "Was I to sit there and take it like a chastised schoolboy?" "You're supposed to be a chastised schoolboy," Klaus countered, though there was a strange new light in his eyes. A quiet, contemplative king who relies on his counsellors, not a wit who trades barbs with French diplomats. "Did it work?" Caspar asked, turning to face him. Klaus was silent for a long moment. "It worked," he admitted grudgingly. The field marshal was impressed. "The court is buzzing about the king's hidden steel. It was effective. But it was not the prince. The real Leopold would have been mortified by such a direct confrontation." Perhaps the real Leopold was a fool, Caspar said, the words out of his mouth before he could stop them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Klaus took a step forward, his voice dangerously quiet. The real Leopold is the reason you wear that crown. Never forget that. You're an instrument of his legacy, not a replacement for it. Your cleverness is a tool, Caspar, not a virtue. Wield it without my direction again, and you will find the stage suddenly and permanently empty. The threat was clear. But as Klaus turned to leave, Caspar saw it again. That flicker in his eyes. It wasn't just anger, it was assessment. The puppet had just tugged on its own strings, and the puppeteer was both alarmed and, despite himself, intrigued. A new, dangerous dynamic had been born in the banquet hall. The impostor king was discovering he had a will of his own. The west wing of Schönbrunn Palace was known as the Quiet Rooms, a euphemism for the place where inconvenient relatives and disgraced courtiers were discreetly housed, their existence fading from the memory of the vibrant court. It was here, in a sunlit chamber stripped of all regalia, that the true Leopold von Habsburg lived. His world was a haze of soft light and softer sounds. The head injury from his fall had not killed him, but it had erased him. His consciousness was a flickering candle in a vast dark room. He would sit for hours by the window, a blanket over his legs, his hands, pale and slender, so like the impostor's, resting limply in his lap. He could be fed, he could be led to his bed, but the spark of recognition, of personality was gone. The court physicians, their silence purchased by Klaus Richter, documented his condition as a profound melancholia, brought on by the shock of his father's death. Only one person visited him with any regularity, his mother, Queen Eleanor. She would sit with him, holding his hand, speaking to him of her day, of court gossip, of memories from his childhood. She never received a response, only the vacant blue-eyed stare that seemed to look through her. "It is a mercy he feels no pain," her lady-in-waiting would whisper. Eleanor would only nod, her jaw tight. But in her heart, a cold, hard certainty was growing. This broken boy in the quiet rooms was her son. The young man holding court in the throne room, the one who had so deftly humiliated the French ambassador, was not. The memory of the tree, the kitten, his response, it had been too polished, too calculated. A genuine memory would have been messier, accompanied by a flicker of real emotion. His had been a perfect recitation. She began her own, quiet investigation. She used the vast network of loyal servants who remembered her as their beloved queen, who whispered secrets the Chancellor and the Privy Councillor would never hear. She learned of Klaus Richter's mysterious pre-dawn errand on the night of the king's death. She heard rumours of a talented player who had vanished from a lowly troupe around the same time. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place during a chance encounter. She was walking in the palace's sculpture gallery when she came upon the king, who was studying a newly acquired bust of Marcus Aurelius. He was alone for a moment, his guards waiting at a respectful distance. He turned and saw her, and immediately the mask of Leopold slipped into place, the respectful, slightly distant smile. "Mother," he said with a nod. "Leopold," she replied, her voice neutral. She gestured to the bust. "It reminds me of your father, the same stoic brow." "A fitting comparison," he said smoothly. "The philosopher-emperor." "There is a poem your father loved," Eleanor said, her heart hammering against her ribs. She took a step closer, her voice dropping. "By Rilke. The one about the panther. He used to read it to you when you were small to help you sleep. You found the rhythm of it so soothing. Do you remember it?" Caspar's mind raced. Rilke. This was not in the files. This was another test, deeper and more dangerous than the one about the kitten. He could see the intensity in her eyes, the desperate hope warring with her terrible suspicion. To admit he did not remember was to fail. To invent a memory was to risk a catastrophic error. He allowed a look of pained sorrow to cross his face, a king remembering a lost father. He looked away from her, back at the marble bust as if the memory was too painful to confront directly. I remember his voice, Mother. The sound of it. The poem itself. It is lost to me, like so much else from that time. The grief. It stole many things." His voice broke perfectly on the last word. It was a masterful performance. using the prince's known sensitivity and the trauma of loss as a shield. He had given her an answer that was both emotionally plausible and impossible to disprove. Eleanor stared at him, her face a pale, immobile mask. She saw the performance for what it was, flawless, brilliant, and utterly hollow. The last vestige of hope died in her eyes, replaced by a glacial coldness. "I see," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The grief has stolen much from us all." She gave a stiff, formal curtsy. "Your Majesty." She turned and walked away, her spine straight, her footsteps echoing in the silent gallery. She did not look back. She knew the truth now, with a certainty that was as absolute as it was devastating. The boy on the throne was a counterfeit, and she, the Queen Mother of Eldoria, was perhaps the only person alive who knew it. The question now was not one of proof, but of what to do with a secret that could shatter a nation. The knowledge was a poison, slow and insidious. Queen Mother Eleanor moved through the palace like a ghost in her own home, the gilded halls now feeling like a stage for a grotesque play. Every time she saw the Impostor King, presiding over a council, bestowing a knighthood, offering a benign smile to a courtier, a fresh wave of revulsion washed over her. The audacity of the deception was breathtaking. They had not just stolen her son's throne, they had buried him alive in a silent room while this actor paraded in his skin. Her initial furious impulse was to expose it all, to march into the throne room and point a trembling finger, to scream the truth to the heavens. But she was a von Habsburg by marriage, a daughter of a powerful ducal house herself. She understood the stakes. To reveal the fraud would not restore her son. It would unleash chaos. The legitimacy of the entire monarchy would evaporate. The very nobles now bowing to the false king would turn on each other in a bloody scramble for power. Eldoria would be torn apart, a carcass for its enemies to pick over. Her son, the real Leopold, would be the first casualty in the ensuing storm. So she became a conspirator in her own tragedy. She played her part. She attended state functions, sitting beside the impostor, her face a serene mask of maternal pride. She offered him public advice, her words carefully crafted to sound supportive while containing nothing of substance. She was the dutiful Queen Mother, and her performance was, in its own way, as masterful as his. In private, she began to weave a web of her own. She could not dismantle the fraud, not yet, but she could gather the threads that might one day allow her to control it, or to orchestrate its end on her own terms. She reached out to those whose loyalty was to the crown as an institution, not to the individual who wore it. The aged Field Marshal Bloch, a man of blunt honesty who had served her husband faithfully. The keeper of the royal archives, a pedantic man who valued historical truth above political convenience. She spoke in careful circles, testing their devotion, probing for any flicker of doubt they might harbour about the new king's peculiarities. Her most dangerous move was a direct approach to Chancellor von Gortz. She cornered him, after a Privy Council meeting, in a corridor where she knew they would not be overheard. "The king grows into his role, does he not, Chancellor?" she began, her tone light, conversational. "He seems harder than he once was, more decisive." Von Gortz, who had grown increasingly stout and nervous over the years, mopped his brow with a silk handkerchief. "Indeed, Your Majesty, grief and responsibility forge a man. He is a credit to his father's memory." "Is he?" Eleanor's voice lost its lightness, becoming as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. She looked directly into his eyes, and in her gaze, he saw that she knew. The carefully constructed fiction he and Klaus had maintained for years, shattered in that single silent moment. The blood drained from his face. "Your Majesty, he stammered. "Do not insult me with denials, Otto," she cut him off, her voice low and deadly. "I know what you and Richter have done. You have committed the greatest treason in the history of this realm. You have placed a puppet on my husband's throne." Von Gortz looked as if he might be sick. "It was to save the kingdom. You know what would have happened. It was the only way." "It was us way," she corrected. "And now we must all live with the consequences. I will not destroy Eldoria to avenge my son, but understand this. Your puppet is now my concern. His actions, his decisions, his very health are a matter of the gravest importance to me. You and Richter will keep me informed. You will involve me in your councils, because if this house of cards you have built should ever fall, I will ensure that it falls on you, and you alone. Do we understand each other?" The Chancellor could only nod. A broken man caught between two ruthless intelligences, Klaus Richter's cold ambition and Queen Eleanor's icy, vengeful resolve. He was no longer a master of the game, but a pawn caught in the middle. The deception had just gained another, infinitely more dangerous keeper. A decade into the reign of King Leopold V, Eldoria was prosperous and stable. The boy king had grown into a man, his public image a carefully curated blend of his purported father's strength and his own cultivated air of thoughtful intelligence. The near disaster of the French ambassador was remembered not as a lapse, but as the moment the king found his voice. Under the surface, however, the tensions between the three architects of the deception, Klaus, the Chancellor, and the Queen Mother, created a constant low hum of political warfare. It was against this backdrop that the von Hessler affair erupted. Count von Hessler, a minor noble from the southern provinces, was a blustering, ambitious man. He had overextended himself in a series of bad investments, and saw a path to recoup his losses by reviving an ancient, nearly forgotten law that granted the crown the right to claim a percentage of all silver mined on noble lands. He presented his case to the Privy Council, arguing it was the king's rightful due and would swell the royal coffers. Chancellor von Gortz, ever the pragmatist, saw the immediate appeal. The treasury could always use more funds. Queen Mother Eleanor, however, recognised it for what it was: a direct assault on the privileges of the older, more established noble families, the very bedrock of the von Habsburg support. It would cause widespread resentment. The matter was brought before the king. The council was divided. Caspar, now a seasoned performer in the role, listened carefully. He saw the greed in von Hessler's eyes, the desperation in von Gortz's, and the cold disapproval in Eleanor's. He also saw an opportunity. For years he had been a mouthpiece. He signed what Klaus put in front of him. He said what he was told to say. But the von Hessler proposal was new. It was a true test of statecraft, a decision that would have real, tangible consequences. The player in him was intrigued. The man who had grown accustomed to power was tempted. Klaus, reading the avaricious glint in Caspar's eye, advised caution. The Count's proposal is a short-term solution that will create long-term enemies. The great houses will see it as tyranny. It is not worth the risk. But Caspar had been reading the ledgers himself. He understood the financial pressures. More than that, he saw a chance to act independently, to make a mark that was his own, not something scripted by Klaus. He remembered the thrill of putting the French Duke in his place. This was bigger. This was policy. He made his decision. He would grant von Hessler's petition. He overruled the quiet, insistent pressure from the Queen Mother and the cautious counsel of Klaus. He stood before the council and in a firm, authoritative voice declared that the ancient law would be enforced. It was the king's will. The reaction was immediate and fierce. The older noble families were outraged. Whispers of ingrate and upstart king began to circulate, the first real cracks in the public facade in a decade. Von Hessler, emboldened, became insufferable, his newfound influence threatening the delicate balance of the court. Klaus confronted Caspar in his private chambers that night. "That was a mistake," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "You have alienated the von Kleists and the Hohenbergs, families whose support is essential. You acted on impulse like the commoner you are, not with the considered judgment of a king." "I acted like a king who needs money to run his kingdom," Caspar shot back, his own temper flaring. "Or have you forgotten that part of the job? I'm not just your puppet to be trotted out for ceremonies. The von Hessler law will bring in revenue. That is a fact." "It will bring in rebellion if we are not careful," Klaus snapped. "You have been on the throne for 10 years, Caspar. Do not mistake the costume for the character. You are playing at being a king, but you lack the instinct, the breeding. You see a chest of coins. A true king sees the web of loyalty and obligation that holds his throne together. Von Gortz was a fool to suggest it, and you were a greater fool to agree. The use of his real name was a deliberate stinging insult." Caspar's face darkened. "Be careful, counsellor, you speak to your king." "I speak to the man I placed on that throne," Klaus retorted, his composure finally cracking. "And I can just as easily remove him. Remember your place." The threat hung in the air between them, more real and more dangerous than it had ever been. The von Hessler affair had done more than just upset the nobility. It had shattered the fragile understanding between the impostor and his maker. Caspar had tasted true, unsanctioned power, and he wanted more. Klaus saw the emergence of a will he could not fully control, a variable that threatened to destroy their entire, meticulously constructed world. The scam of the century was beginning to rot from the inside. The fallout from the von Hessler decision was a slow-burning fuse. While the royal treasury did indeed see an increase in revenue, the political cost became increasingly apparent. Petitions of grievance penned in the flowery, insult-laden language of the aristocracy piled up on the chancellor's desk. The great houses, the von Kleists and Hohenbergs, began to withdraw from court life, their absence a silent, potent protest. It was the Queen Mother who moved first to capitalize on the rift. She requested a private audience with the king, a request that could not be refused. She found him in the Royal Observatory, a place the real Leopold had loved, and which Caspar had adopted as part of his persona, finding a genuine peace among the silent celestial maps. "Leopold," she began, her tone not confrontational, but that of a concerned parent. "There is talk, unsettling talk." Caspar turned from the great brass telescope, his expression carefully neutral. "There is always talk, mother. It is the currency of courts." "This is different," she insisted, gliding further into the room. "The von Hessler decree, it has caused a deep wound. The old families feel you are turning against them, that you favour upstarts and flatterers like the Count." She paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. "A king must balance the books, it is true, but he must also balance the hearts of his nobles. Your father understood that. It is what kept him secure on his throne for 30 years. She was offering him a way out, positioning herself as the voice of his father's wisdom in direct opposition to Klaus's cold pragmatism. Caspar recognized the gambit. He was surrounded by players, all trying to direct his performance. "And what would you have me do?" he asked, feigning a weary openness. "Rescind the decree," she said simply. "Announce that upon further reflection, and in consultation with your loyal advisers," she gave a slight, meaningful nod. "You have decided the ancient law is too disruptive. You will forgive the back payments. It will be seen as an act of magnanimous strength, not weakness. It will win back the von Kleists and silence the whispers. It was a smart play. It would repair the damage, make him look wise and decisive, and, not incidentally, strengthen her influence at the expense of Klaus's." Caspar saw the logic, but he also felt a stubborn resistance. To rescind it would be a public admission that Klaus had been right, that he, the king, had made an error in judgment. It would be a step back into the role of the pliable puppet. "I will consider it," he said, a non-committal answer he had learned from Klaus himself. Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly, but she accepted it with a graceful incline of her head. "That is all a mother can ask." She turned to leave, but stopped at the door. "Oh, and Leopold, your brother, the Archduke Karl of Austria, sends his regards. He writes that he was sorry to hear of the strain the new tax has caused. He is ever a friend to Eldoria." The message was perfectly delivered, a masterstroke of political threat wrapped in familial concern. The Archduke Karl was a powerful, ambitious man and the Queen Mother's cousin. She was subtly reminding him that she had allies outside of Eldoria, that if the situation within the kingdom became untenable, there were other players who could be invited onto the stage. After she left, Caspar stood in the silent observatory, the Queen's words echoing in his mind. He was trapped. Klaus wanted him to be a silent, efficient tool. The Queen wanted him to be a repentant son, following her script. Von Gortz just wanted the problem to go away. No one saw him as a king in his own right. They saw an instrument, a figurehead, a prize to be controlled. He looked through the telescope, not at the moon or the planets, but at the distant lights of Vienna twinkling in the valley below. That was his kingdom. A kingdom he had ruled for a decade. A kingdom he had, in his own flawed way, helped to keep stable and prosperous. A fierce, possessive pride swelled in his chest. He had started as a fraud, but the lines had blurred. The crown had become a part of him. He would not be a pawn in their games any longer. The von Hessler decree would stand. It was his decision. Let the nobles grumble. Let Klaus fume. Let the Queen Mother scheme. He was King Leopold V, and he would start acting like it. The puppet was cutting his strings. The decision to let the von Hessler decree stand sent ripples through the foundation of the conspiracy. Klaus Richter's fury was a cold, sharp thing. He did not shout. He became quieter, more still, his presence in a room like a drop in temperature. The daily briefings grew terse, the flow of information carefully filtered. He was reasserting control, tightening the leash, reminding Caspar that every document, every appointment, every public word still passed through his hands. But Caspar had tasted autonomy, and the flavour was addictive. He began to push back in small, almost imperceptible ways. He would forget to use a specific turn of phrase Klaus had crafted for a speech, substituting one of his own. He would linger in conversations with ambassadors, asking questions that went beyond his scripted brief. He started taking solitary, heavily guarded walks in the palace gardens, a simple act of independence that Klaus disapproved of, citing security. The tension between them was a silent war fought in glances and pauses. The court, attuned to the slightest shift in the political winds, sensed it. The Chancellor, von Gortz, found himself scurrying between the two, a harried diplomat trying to prevent a civil war within the royal chambers. It was during this fragile stalemate that a new, unexpected variable entered the equation: Lady Isabella von Hohenberg. She was the daughter of the Duke of Hohenberg, one of the most powerful nobles alienated by the von Hessler decree. She had been away at a remote family estate for years, and her return to court was a statement in itself. She was beautiful, with fiery auburn hair and a wit as sharp as a stiletto. She was also, quite clearly, her father's agent. Klaus saw her as a threat, a honeyed trap. "You will be courteous, but distant," he instructed Caspar. "The Hohenbergs are attempting to sway you through charm where argument failed. Do not give them the satisfaction." But when Caspar met Isabella at a state ball, he found himself disarmed. She did not simper or flatter. When presented to the king, she curtsied with a flawless deep respect that held not a trace of submission. Her eyes, when they met his, were intelligent and direct. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice a clear, carrying contralto. "The palace is even more magnificent than I remembered, though I understand you have been making alterations to the financial architecture as well." The boldness of the remark, delivered with a perfectly straight face, startled a genuine laugh from Caspar. It was a sound the court had rarely heard, unrehearsed and entirely his own. "One must modernize, Lady Isabella," he replied, falling into the easy banter of his old player self, "even if the old stones groan in protest." "Stones are patient, Your Majesty," she countered, a sly smile playing on her lips. "They can bear the weight of centuries. It is the living who are often less resilient." Their conversation continued, a dazzling, dangerous dance of double entendre and political fencing. She was probing him, testing the man behind the crown, and Caspar, for the first time in a decade, felt he was conversing with someone who saw him, not the ghost of Prince Leopold. He was using his own wit, his own intelligence, not lines written by Klaus. It was exhilarating. He began to seek her out. They walked in the gardens he had claimed as his own. They discussed poetry, philosophy, and the state of the kingdom. She was fiercely loyal to her family and critical of his policies, but she argued with a respect that acknowledged his intellect. With Isabella, he didn't have to pretend to be the dreamy, sensitive Leopold. He could be sharp, decisive, even cynical. He could be Caspar. Klaus watched this budding rapport with mounting alarm. He had a dossier on Isabella within days. She was 22, well-educated, unmarried, and known for her stubborn will. She was the perfect vessel for Hohenberg influence. In Klaus's eyes, she wasn't just a noblewoman, she was a hostile invasion. "You're playing with fire," Klaus warned him one evening. "She will coax secrets from you with her smiles. She will use your interest to dismantle everything we have built." "Perhaps I'm tired of what we have built," Caspar retorted, staring out at the city lights. "Perhaps I wish to build something of my own." The statement hung in the air, a declaration of war. The impostor king was no longer content with his gilded cage. He was looking for a key, and in the fiery Lady von Hohenberg he believed he might have found one. The scam was not just threatened by exposure from the outside, it was now being challenged from the throne itself. The relationship between the king and Lady Isabella became the primary fascination of the court. Their public debates during evening receptions were followed as intently as a jousting tournament. The old nobility, led by the Duke of Hohenberg, watched with cautious hope. They saw in their daughter's influence a chance to soften the king's stance, to roll back the hated von Hessler decree. Chancellor von Gortz saw a potential new power block forming, one that could sideline both him and Klaus Richter. For Klaus, it was an unmitigated disaster. Every moment Caspar spent with Isabella was a moment he was outside of Klaus's control, developing allegiances and ideas that ran counter to their survival. The carefully constructed persona of King Leopold V was being subtly rewritten by an auburn-haired scribe. The crisis point came during a small private concert in the royal music room. Caspar and Isabella were seated slightly apart from the main group, speaking in low tones. The decree could be amended, not rescinded, Isabella was saying, her voice a persuasive murmur. A tiered system, based on the age of the mine and the title of the holder. It would show flexibility, a willingness to listen. My father and the others would see it as a victory, and the Treasury would still see its share. It was a smart, nuanced solution, one that showcased a political acumen Klaus found deeply threatening. Caspar was nodding, impressed. It has merit. I will have the secretaries draft a proposal. Perhaps, Isabella said, leaning closer, her voice dropping even further. You could review it with me before it goes to the Privy Council. Sometimes, those who have been in court too long see problems where there are only opportunities. It was a direct slight against Klaus, and Caspar, flattered by her trust and intoxicated by her proximity, agreed. Of course. From across the room, Klaus watched this intimate exchange. He saw the look in Caspar's eyes, not the performative grief of Leopold, nor the calculated ambition he himself had cultivated, but something genuine, and therefore profoundly dangerous. The puppet was not just cutting its strings, it was inviting a new puppeteer onto the stage. That night, Klaus did not come to Caspar's chambers for their usual briefing. Instead, Caspar found a single, folded note on his desk. It was not in Klaus's usual precise hand, but in a clumsy, printed script. It contained only 5 words. She knows you are false. The blood drained from Caspar's face. The paper felt like ice in his hand. Was it a bluff? A desperate tactic from Klaus to scare him away from Isabella? Or had his own carelessness, his moment of genuine connection, betrayed him? He read the words again, his mind racing. Isabella's probing questions, her intense scrutiny. Had it been more than intellectual curiosity? Had she been investigating him? Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. This was different from the Queen Mother's suspicion. Eleanor was bound by her own need to protect the kingdom. Isabella owed him no such loyalty. If she knew, and if she told her father, the Hohenbergs would not hesitate to use that knowledge to destroy him and seize power for themselves. The gilded walls of his chamber seemed to close in on him. The crown on its stand across the room seemed to mock him. For 10 years he had lived with the fear of discovery, but it had been an abstract threat. Now, it had a face. It had auburn hair and a clever smile. He burned the note in the fireplace, watching the flames consume the terrifying words. But he could not burn away their meaning. Klaus had successfully planted a seed of paranoia that would now poison every interaction with the one person who made him feel real. The trust was broken. The impostor king was alone once more, trapped between a manipulative guardian and a potential betrayer, the weight of his deception suddenly heavier than ever before. The note changed everything. The following day, when Caspar saw Isabella in the portrait gallery, her smile seemed laced with hidden meaning. Her clever remarks felt less like banter and more like interrogation. He became guarded, his responses to her more formal, retreating behind the well-practiced mask of King Leopold. Isabella noticed the shift immediately. "Your Majesty seems preoccupied," she commented, her head tilted. "Is the weight of the crown particularly heavy today?" "The crown is always heavy, my lady," he replied, his tone distant, his eyes avoiding hers. "It is a burden one must bear alone." She studied him for a long moment, the warmth fading from her expression, replaced by a cool, analytical gaze. "Indeed, though I had begun to think you might welcome a trusted companion to share its load." She gave a slight, disappointed curtsy. "I see I was mistaken." She left him there, standing before a painting of his father, King Alaric. The sense of loss was acute. Had Klaus been telling the truth? Or had he, in his paranoia, just destroyed the one genuine connection he had made in a decade of lies? The doubt was a torture more exquisite than any the royal torturers could have devised. He confronted Klaus that evening in the chief privy councillor's office, a room even more dense with files and secrets than his own. "The note," Caspar said, slamming the door shut behind him. "Was it true?" Klaus looked up from his desk, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Truth is a fluid concept in our line of work, Your Majesty. The question is not its veracity, but its effect. It has made you cautious, It has reminded you of the stakes. That is its purpose." So it was a lie. Caspar felt a surge of relief, quickly followed by fury. "I did not say that," Klaus replied calmly, setting down his quill. "I merely gathered information and presented it to you. Lady Isabella has been making discreet inquiries about your childhood. She has spoken to an old, half-blind nursemaid who was dismissed from service years ago. She's piecing together a puzzle. The note was a summary of my assessment." The relief evaporated, so it was both a manipulation and a potential truth. Klaus had used a real threat to achieve his desired outcome. It was diabolical. "You cannot send her away," Caspar stated, a new resolve hardening within him. He would not be managed so transparently. "You cannot alienate the Hohenbergs further. It would confirm their every suspicion." "Agreed," Klaus said, to Caspar's surprise. "Which is why you will continue your association with her. But henceforth, you will be the one controlling the narrative. You will feed her information. You will use her affection for the crown, or for the man she believes you to be, to steer her investigations into harmless channels. You will make her your unwitting ally, not your adversary." The cold brilliance of the plan was typical Klaus. Turn the threat into a tool. But it required Caspar to descend to a new level of deception, to systematically betray the trust of the woman he was growing to care for. He would have to look into her eyes and lie, not as part of a grand performance for a faceless court, but intimately, personally. "It seems I am to be a king of lies upon lies," Caspar said, his voice thick with disgust. "You are the king we made you," Klaus replied, his gaze unwavering, "and you will do what is necessary to survive. The alternative is not just your death, but the collapse of everything. Remember the boy in the West Wing. His continued quiet existence depends on your continued performance. This is not a game, Caspar. It hasn't been for a very long time." The reminder of the real Leopold was Klaus's ultimate weapon, a checkmate move that always worked. Caspar felt the fight drain out of him. He was trapped. He had to become the manipulator Klaus wanted him to be, or see it all burn. He had to break Isabella's heart before she could break his neck. He left the office, his shoulders slumped not in the feigned grief of Leopold, but in the genuine despair of Caspar. The path ahead was darker than ever, requiring a cruelty he wasn't sure he possessed. The scam was no longer just about wearing a crown. It was about destroying anything and anyone that threatened it. The final act of the Great Deception began not with a bang, but with a cough, a dry, rattling sound that echoed in the cavernous royal bedchamber. King Leopold V, now in the 20th year of his reign, lay in the same great bed where his father had died. The official diagnosis was a sudden aggressive lung fever. The truth, known only to Klaus Richter, was more precise. It was a slow, cumulative poison, administered in his wine over many months, a necessary conclusion to a performance that had run its course. Caspar was fading, and he knew it. The vigour that had characterised his rule was seeping away, replaced by a profound weariness. The court physicians, some genuinely perplexed, others silently complicit, could do nothing. As he lay there, his mind, sharpened by a lifetime of observation, pieced it together. The timing was too convenient. The von Hessler affair had been contained, but the resentment simmered. Lady Isabella, though her influence had waned under his deliberate coldness, remained a potential spark. He had become a liability. Klaus was staging the final, tragic scene. One evening, as a late autumn storm lashed at the windows, Klaus dismissed the physicians and sat by the bed. The two men, bound by their terrible secret, looked at each other in the flickering firelight. "It is time," Klaus said, his voice devoid of emotion. "The succession is secure. The cousin from the Bavarian branch is a dull man, but pliable. The kingdom will endure." Caspar tried to laugh, but it turned into a racking cough. Endure. A fine epitaph for a king, for a man. He fixed his fading gaze on Klaus. "Did you ever see me as anything more than your creation? Your tool?" Klaus considered the question dispassionately. "I saw potential, and for a time you exceeded it. You grew beyond the script. That was both impressive and inconvenient. A king must be predictable. You became an artist, and statecraft is no place for art. It is a science of control." "And the boy," Caspar whispered, the words a struggle. "The real Leopold?" "He died last week," Klaus said flatly. "A sudden fever. He will be buried in the royal crypt, a minor prince who predeceased his brother. A footnote, the last loose end tied. A profound sorrow, not for himself, but for the innocent life erased twice over, washed through Caspar. He had lived this man's life, worn his face, and now, in death, he would finally erase him completely. 20 years, Caspar breathed, staring at the canopy above. I ruled for 20 years. I built roads, settled disputes, led this nation, and no one ever knew. That was the point, Klaus said, standing to leave. You played your part. History will remember King Leopold V as a wise and stable ruler. That is the only truth that matters now. He left, and Caspar was alone with the storm and the creeping dark. He thought of the beer hall, of the smell of sawdust and ale. He thought of the thrill of that first bow in the cathedral, the weight of the crown. He thought of Isabella's intelligent eyes, and the life he might have had. He had been a fraud, a pawn, a king, and a prisoner. He had lived a dozen lives in one. As consciousness began to slip away, the actor in him rose for one final private performance. He straightened the covers. He composed his features into the serene, noble mask of a dying monarch. He, Caspar, would choose his own exit. He would die as a king. When they found him in the morning, the court physicians remarked on the peaceful dignity of his passing. The bells of Vienna tolled, mourning the loss of a beloved king. The nation plunged into official grief. The scam was over. It had been, from beginning to end, the performance of a lifetime. And as the official chronicles began to write the hagiography of King Leopold V, the truth was buried deep, another hidden secret of the nobility lost to the dust of history.